Okay, here we go. Hello and welcome. Hi, thanks for joining us. It's good to see you on this lovely morning. It's a Friday morning, so I hope today is not too full on for you. I hope today's going to be a nice and relaxing day, and you can spend the day maybe even talking or thinking about research. So this is a great place to be. Thanks so much for joining us. This is the ACEN Research Conversation. So it's a place where we can get together and talk about our research, think about the way our research can convert into publications and disseminations, and also it's a way that we can connect with each other as well. If you're part of the ACEN membership, and a special warm welcome to those of you who are joining us overseas. If you're in New Zealand, hello to you as well. We had a number of registrations. We had close to 80 registrations. So there's lots of interest in the ACEN research conversations, which is just so exciting. My name is Dr. Bonnie Dean. I'm from the University of Wollongong and I sit on the ACEN Board of Directors. And I'd love to take a moment to acknowledge this wonderful country. The land that I'm currently sitting on is Dharawal country, and it's a warm, beautiful day. We're moving into spring, so the wattle is out. And I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge the Indigenous lands that you're currently residing on. It's a place of knowledge and learning and growth, and so I really wanted to start by acknowledging our Indigenous custodians of land. Today we're going to be talking about the do's and don'ts of publication. So this is a great topic for those who are new to publishing, and also a bit of a refresher for those of you who have been publishing for some time. Our facilitators today are representatives of ACEN, and I'll introduce them in a moment, as well as our guest speaker as well. Let me introduce our facilitators first. So if you're going to be a facilitator, I'll get you to show your screen right now, or give us a little bit of a wave as I call your name out. So we have Matthew Campbell from Torrens University, Michelle Eadie from the University of Wollongong, Carly Twyford from the University of Newcastle, Anna Rowe from the University of New Zealand. And I'd like to introduce you to our facilitator, but also our presenter today, which is Trina Joe from Deakin, a senior lecturer at Deakin University. So what we'll do is we'll hear from Trina. She's going to give us a presentation. We're so excited to have Trina join us today. She is an editor on the Journal of Teaching and Learning for Graduate Employability. And that might be a space that you're interested in publishing a paper in. So we're so excited to hear directly from an editor today on some of the do's and don'ts of publishing. So Trina, I'd like to invite you now to take some time to run us through some tips and advice that you can share with us as researchers in will and employability. Over to you now.
Thanks, Bonnie. Just check that my slides are showing okay. Is that right?
Yep. Beautifully.
Okay, excellent. So I guess I would like to start by also acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I am, and I'm really fortunate to have returned to Noongar land, which is where I grew up in Perth. So I thought I might just start by giving you a little bit of context for my experience. I've been publishing in graduate employability and various topics, within that, including will and strategies for embedding, assessing and assuring graduate capabilities, and leveraging student-staff partnerships to enhance employability and address some of the inequities experienced by some cohorts in terms of graduate employment outcomes. So yeah, for about 6 years now, I've been publishing in this area, which has given me some appreciation for how, what to do and what not to do in terms of getting published on this topic. And as Bonnie mentioned, I'm also an editor for the Journal of Teaching and Learning for Graduate Employability, which I think has actually really helped me to become better at publishing myself, because it really does give you an appreciation for some of the common mistakes that people tend to make when it comes to navigating the publication process. But before I sort of narrow it down and focus on the publication process itself, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the broader challenges that are commonly associated with doing research in education and employability. A couple of years ago, I had an opportunity to actually do a little bit of research looking at the research aspirations and challenges experienced by my colleagues in Deakin Learning Futures. And I found that pretty much all of us were really interested in contributing to research, including both academic and professional staff, but none of us were really doing as much research as we would have liked to have done. And by far the biggest challenge that was preventing us from doing as much research as we would like was making time and balancing competing priorities, which I'm sure is something that you all relate to, given the nature of our roles. And then a second challenge, which was really common, was inexperience either in research in general. So we had some staff members who hadn't really done any research before or had done very little. But we also had some very experienced scholars who had been researching in one discipline, like maybe science or health or something else, but they weren't really, they were new to publishing in education. So that's another common challenge experienced. So I thought I would, as someone who has actually transitioned from a science background to a career focused entirely on education and employability, I thought I would share some of the strategies that I find effective for overcoming those broad challenges, and I'll then narrow down and focus on different aspects of the publication process itself, things like choosing the right journal to increase your chance of getting published quickly, so having the right fit, but also maximizing your impact by reaching the audience that you want to. It's another thing that's really important when you're picking where you publish. I'll also talk a bit about why you might consider publishing in the Journal of Teaching and Learning for graduate employability itself. And I'm happy to be quite honest about the strengths and some of the cons of publishing with that particular journal, so because getting the fit is really important. And then I'll talk a bit about some things you might want to consider in regards to actually finishing off your manuscript and getting it published. So I know that we can't make more time. Time is an issue for all of us. I think it's gotten far, far worse with the pandemic, both in terms of the energy we have to spend time on research, but also just because the needs of the students and the colleagues that we support, I think, has really expanded. But the fact is that if you put research last, you will never get to it, because there's always going to be something else demanding your attention. So some of the ways that I combat that is I try to block out time for research. And I also think about when I'm most productive. So something that I see people do a lot is block out time in their calendar, but then still never quite get to it, because maybe you put your research time at the end of the day and then other tasks get in the way and take longer than you think. And then by the time you get to research, you really don't have a lot of energy left. Or another thing is where you put it at the end of the week and then, again, tasks blow out. And Friday's often a day where you might not have the same energy as you did earlier in the week, or you might end up taking a long weekend or something like that. So, research is always getting put on the back burner. So as much as possible, block out some time when you're most productive, whether that's blocking out a whole day or a bit of time every morning or a few mornings a week. Every bit counts. It's also really important to write regularly. I think that often getting started is harder, or is the hardest part of writing. So if you can write regularly, it really helps with maintaining momentum. And again, it might be that you sort of try and write every day. I do. I definitely don't write every day. But if I'm aiming to write every day and I put it off a few days, then at least hopefully I'll be getting some research done. It's all about sort of, I guess, managing yourself and your workload. Another piece of advice that I have for making time for research is really about using your time most effectively and collaborating with others. That means you can share workload, but also accountability helps me to actually prioritize research. So I'm the kind of person who often puts my own priorities on the back burner because students and colleagues are important to me. And I think that a lot of us who work in education are really passionate about supporting others. So it's very easy to, again, put research on the back burner, but use the power of accountability to others and that guilt or not wanting to let others down to help you actually prioritize research. And finally, a thing that I do, and I didn't really start doing on purpose, but it sort of happened and others sort of made me more aware of it, was leverage what you already do. So if your research relates to your practice, it's often a lot easier to justify the time that you spend on research, both to yourself and to others. So that's another way of making sure research isn't always put on the back burner. In terms of developing skills and knowledge, like I said, I had a lot of challenges transitioning from predominantly quantitative research in science to gaining the skills and experience I needed to do educational research and gaining the confidence that I needed. But don't let inexperience and confidence hold you back. There's lots of ways that you can gain experience in research in education or in employability more specifically, you do need to develop specific skills, and you do need to develop a good knowledge of the literature so that you can build on it. But again, a way to not need to learn everything at once and to use your time more effectively, especially if you are going to continue publishing in another discipline, but you're interested in also doing some work in education or employability, is to utilise co-researchers who have more familiarity with the literature and can help to direct you to the right research or write those sections of the paper. Or you might want to work with co-researchers who have experience in a specific methodology that you're not familiar with. And that could be that you're a new scholar who needs to learn some educational research techniques. But also, when I did that piece of work in my department, a lot of the more experienced researchers also wanted to expand their research skills. And so working with co-researchers is a really good way of doing that. Also, something that I sort of resisted doing to begin with, because I felt bad asking others for help, was reaching out to a critical friend or a community of practice, such as the ACEN group, to actually get other people to critique your work and give you a bit of peer review before you go through the formal peer review process. It's generally a lot quicker to get help from a critical friend or a community of practice than it is to go through the peer review process and then have be rejected or have to make major changes. So don't be afraid to reach out to those around you, and then make sure you pay it forward later on, either by helping that person edit something of theirs or by paying it forward to someone else as you become more experienced. You can also learn a huge amount by reading research, so make sure you're reading regularly in the journal and on the topic that you're interested in publishing in. It's really, really helpful. And seek other formal and professional learning opportunities. So if you're a member of HERDSA, which people are when they go to the conference, although I'm conscious it has been put off for a few years now, but if you're part of a member of HERDSA, you have access to some scholarship of teaching and learning modules which they put together a few years ago, and that can be a really good resource for new scholars. And other societies and conferences often have sort of workshops during the conference which spend a more considerable amount of time looking at particular areas of research or helping new scholars develop skills in this area. And also consider journals that are supportive of new scholars, like the Journal of Learning and Teaching for Graduate Employability. So while the standards of what we publish are really important to us, we tend to, where the research that's been done is interesting and is relevant, we tend to be a bit more generous with providing scholars with feedback and helping them to improve their paper rather than just rejecting it outright like some other papers might. So, and I know that that's the case with some other journals. For example, a lot of the ISOTL journals are often, they like to support new scholars in the scholarship of teaching and learning. So they're really quite generous with providing really detailed feedback, which can be incredibly helpful with developing your research skills. So that's a good segue to choosing the right journal. And so there are a couple of things that I would encourage you to think about here. People tend to think a lot about metrics, things like impact factor and rankings, but something that is equally important, or equally if not more important, is thinking about who your audience is. So obviously look at the scope of the journal and to make sure it fits, because otherwise you're going to get rejected outright, probably by the editor, but sometimes that can take time and it'll sit on the editor's desk. But another thing to think about is, what conversation do you want to join? So a thing I tend to do is I might write up a piece of research before I know exactly where I want to publish it, but then I'll look at the publications that are cited in the paper. Research should be about joining a conversation. So it's probably going to be one of the journals that you cite the most that you're going to, that's most appropriate for you to publish in. And if you haven't cited papers in the journal that you intend to publish in when you're going to submit to a journal, do make sure you include some of those, because that is one of the things that editors look for, and you could get rejected outright because you haven't acknowledged research that's relevant and you're not joining that conversation. You might also want to think about the journals that you've read. Often the work we do is relevant to people who are in similar roles to us, and so people like you might be your intended audience, and so those journals might be worth considering. But you might also, especially as you become more experienced, be thinking about opportunities to expand your personal research audience. So as people become familiar with your work, you might want to start publishing in different journals. And so as you do that, I would recommend that you start reading those journals more regularly, or at least look at some examples to make sure that you are fitting in with their style and you understand their audience and the language that they use, because those things are really important to getting published and even getting through that first step of the editorial board. If research metrics are important to your career progression, then it's also okay, of course, to consider metrics. I think that's actually really important. It can count towards promotion, and often if your research impact or metrics are good, then it often helps you to actually justify time spent on research and get more support from your department. So you might want to look at the specific metrics which are encouraged by your institution or your specific department. So I'm sort of encouraged to publish in Q1 journals, or that upper quartile in terms of rankings. Whereas when I was publishing in science, we sort of focused a bit more impact factor. So find out what the specific metrics that are important for your role or your department, and you might want to think about publishing there. Deakin has a really useful tool which lists all the different metrics for a specific journal, and also whether it's a recommended publication place for Deakin researchers. So have a look if your university has a tool like that. And if there isn't a specific tool, so ours is with the library, there will definitely be a list somewhere. So talk to some more experienced researchers and find out where it's going to benefit you most to publish. But that said, I still, even though those rankings are kind of important to me and my career progression, I still publish in other places because I'm not just interested in metrics. I actually want my research to have impact. So I still go back and think about who I want to actually read my research, and, especially where it's practical, who do I want to act on that research? So, and that's important to both getting your citations up so that the people who are reading that journal are interested in it, notice your research, and then build on that knowledge, and also actually getting the ideas out in the world and actually having an impact on education and employability practice. You might also want to think about whether it's important for your publication to be open access. If your target audience are other academics who are at universities, then they probably have access to a broad range of journals through their institution. But actually, if your research has broader applications, so for other practitioners and people who, maybe industry, or you want students even to read your research, or the general public, then having your article open access becomes really important. So that's something that you might consider. Most journals will allow you to pay for open access, but that can be extremely expensive. It's not generally something that I can afford, but journals like the Journal of Learning and Teaching for Graduate Employability provide free open access publication. So that's another reason you might want to consider publishing with us. Another thing to consider is the length of the peer review process. Some journals sort of have a minimum of 6 months, and if you get rejected, can even blow out to taking a year before you're actually published. And some have a sort of a longer process before you get published online and then put into an actual journal. So if that's important to you, you might want to consider where you publish and choose somewhere with a short peer review process. And that can be really important where you're a new scholar, and so you really just need to get some publications out there to start having that research record. Or if, like me, you have kind of struggled with focusing on research as much during the pandemic, and so you want to get some things out quickly, then you might consider publishing somewhere like the Journal of Teaching and Learning for Graduate Employability, because we have a continuous publication process. And yes, so finally, that the point which I actually kind of made earlier, which was think about, if you're a new scholar, whether the journal is supportive of people like you and will help you to improve your article rather than rejecting it outright. So I've kind of covered the reasons why you should publish or consider publishing with the Journal of Teaching and Learning for Graduate Employability, but just to sort of go back to those, one is also we have that dedicated focus on graduate employability, and that can be a good thing or a bad thing depending on who your intended audience is. It makes it very easy to build on research. So if you want to publish with us, make sure you read some of our articles. We have some really wonderful work that's been published by really experienced scholars. So while we're supportive of new scholars, we also have some contributors who have done really impactful pieces of research on employability, work integrated learning, people like Beverly Oliver, Mance York, and Jan Arel, who have really been pioneers on a lot of these topics. So have a read through that research, and it's an opportunity to build the conversation. Of course, if what you're trying to do is convince people to consider different strategies for embedding employability into the curriculum, people who are not already doing that, then it might not be the best place for you to publish, because you're going to be preaching to the choir and talking to enthusiasts and building on that specific knowledge, but you might not be reaching other people. So you might want to consider a more sort of general audience or just a specific audience. If you're doing work related to employability in science, for example, you might look at science education journals. I've already talked about open access and our continuous publication process. So essentially, we do have issues, but we add to those on a rolling basis. And so we try to get your publications out to review immediately. The only hold up is finding reviewers, and you can help us to find reviewers for you quickly by thinking of, getting your manuscript up to a good standard before you submit. And I'll talk a bit about that later. But yes, this continuous publication system means that you don't have to wait for the next issue. We get information out really quickly. As I mentioned, I think I love about the journal is that we take the time to support new scholars in providing that detailed feedback. The editorial board and our journal manager do a lot of that, but we also have some really wonderful reviewers who really put in a lot of time to give authors who've done really interesting and relevant research the opportunity to develop the skills they need to get that published. And we also really encourage papers which are co-authored by all sorts of different people. So not just academics and education providers, but also employers, industry bodies, graduates and students. I recently had some students of mine publish in our special issue on micro-credentials. And so this is just to show that although we're focused on graduate employability, the range of different aspects of that topic that we explore through the journal are actually really broad. So I do encourage you, if you haven't already, to go and look at some of the different topics that we cover and read the journal. And we also accept two different types of papers, traditional papers of up to 8,000 words, which go through that double-blind peer review process. And that can include research-based evaluations and evidence-based practices, but also more conceptual pieces, so investigations of the literature in the field and new theoretical approaches. And then more recently, we've also started welcoming practitioner reflections, or I like to think of these more as short provocations. So these are up to 2,000 words and they go to editorial review. And it's a chance to, I guess, investigate, sticky problems or wicked problems, I think the term is, and to, perhaps if you have a strong opinion on a topic, or you see an opportunity for innovation or change, or you just have a rant that you really want to get out there, but you can form an argument for it, then consider writing a provocation. I wrote one recently and I found it was a really fun way of writing. Key here is being quite focused. So focus on a specific argument and keep your argument quite concise so that it is really engaging and hopefully a bit provocative and gets everyone thinking. So not sure how I'm going for time, Bonnie, so do tell me if I am running out, because I don't have a very good time device going. So some tips on getting published. So one of the first things is make a good first impression. First impressions count. That means that your abstract is really, really important. And it's something that often by the time we get to the abstract, we're a bit fatigued. Or perhaps you mapped out your abstract at the start of the paper to give you some direction, but then you don't visit it. So it's really important to spend the time making sure that your abstract is compelling. It's what the editors are probably going to send out to get a reviewer to look at your work. So if it's not compelling, or if it's badly written, reviewers are going to and ah, they're going to be less likely to say yes, and it's going to take the editor longer to find a reviewer who's willing to look at your work. Also, make sure your abstract is compelling. Some people sort of, I think, try and build suspense through the abstract and they problematize, but they don't communicate what they did and how. And so really importantly, say you need to communicate what you did, why you did it, how you did it, and most importantly, so what, why should I care? That's how you make sure your abstract is compelling, and make sure it's consistent with the rest of the paper. I'm often quite surprised where I read an abstract and it sounds like the paper is going to be about one thing, but when then I read the rest of the paper, it's actually quite different, and that's quite off-putting as well. And you're going to be asked to make changes. So you may as well get that right the first time and save yourself time. On that, make sure you don't waste time by submitting too early. I know that we're keen to get things published, and I know that we're busy, and editing isn't the most fun task, but the editor isn't paid to fix your grammar or your sentence structure. And you're also wasting your own time, because if you submit your article before it's ready and you need major changes, it takes a lot longer for it to then go back, you make the changes, but then it'll probably have to be sent back out for review. So it's going to sit on the editor's desk for a bit longer. It's going to sit on the reviewer's desk for a bit longer, and it all really drags out the publication process. So it's not really a good use of time in the long run. And like I said, it's better to not waste the time of the editor with those sort of grammatical errors. It's okay if that's something that you struggle with, but consider getting feedback from a colleague or a critical friend. And I also find that it's really useful getting feedback from a critical friend where what you're publishing on is maybe controversial or quite innovative. You might want to get some different perspectives on that, so that once again, you can speed through the publication process. Make sure you focus on what is relevant to your audience. So you need to emphasize how your paper actually contributes to knowledge and the implications for others. Something that people do is we often talk about everything that we did. So it's not about including every detail of what you did. You need to focus on the details that are relevant to your audience, understanding what you did and why, and how it's actually relevant to them. I think that's a mistake that new scholars often make, and we sort of end up writing papers which are more like a project report, and that might be relevant to your institution, but not so relevant to a broader journal audience, which are a bit less tolerant. And part of that is also making sure you don't provide unnecessary detail like institution-specific terms or acronyms. So things like course codes and unit codes and things that are really only going to be understood by people at your institution and are not really relevant to the story. Another tip is that it's really important to tailor your structure, language, and examples to the specific journal. So if I'm rejected by one journal, I'll always go back and look at what reframing I need to do to get it published in the new journal that I am aiming for. And so it's really important to do that every time. Do look at the journal guidelines, but also I find it incredibly useful to look at published examples. There's often a lot of flexibility in the kind of sections you use when you're publishing educational research and research and employability. So looking at the published examples and making sure the kind of structure you would like to use is accepted into that journal is a good way of making sure you'll actually get published and there won't be major revisions related to simple things like structure. Another thing is to sort of look at, in particular, the methodology is a place where people often come unstuck. Some journals want a lot of information about your conceptual framework and that, why, not just what you did, but why you use the methodology that you did. Whereas other journals are a bit more flexible with that and they're happy to be a bit more practical, and you might be able to just sort of, use a more general description of having used thematic analysis or something like that. So have a look at the journal and see what other authors have done. And if there's a lot of conceptual framing, that's probably something that you're going to need to include in your paper. And another thing is consider the actual context of the journal. So if it's an Australian journal, it might be okay to just refer to Australian examples. But if you're trying to publish somewhere that's an international journal, it's a good idea to try and look for examples that are relevant to your audience and draw from different contexts. I find that this is really, really important when you're publishing in American journals in particular, and also getting the language itself right too. So things like at Deakin, we use the term course to refer to a degree, but other institutions use the term course to refer to a subject or unit of study. So using the word degree is a bit more global, so it works across different contexts, but there's also sort of different language in different countries. In particular, I find work integrated learning and even employability as a pedagogy and as a research topic isn't as mainstreamed in America. It is actually quite emerging. There's a lot of work beginning to happen, but there's still a lot of resistance. So it's probably important to look at what's already published in the journal. And if there isn't anything published on will or employability, it might not be worth wasting your time trying to publish there. You might want to think about a more appropriate place to publish your work, because you might just get rejected. Make sure you cite relevant research. That sounds pretty obvious, but you'll be surprised how many people ignore research which is published in the journal itself. And we've already spoken about joining a conversation. But also it's not okay to, where there is a huge body of research, which is often the case in relation to will and employability, to cite a single paper which isn't even the most relevant paper. That's definitely something that as an editor, I'm not going to let your article get published until you show your understanding of the research. And you also make sure that when other people are reading your paper, they're pointed to the relevant research and the right people are acknowledged, and you're building on what we already know. And another thing that is problematic is when I notice that you haven't referred to any contemporary research. So I get alarm bells when I see that everything you've cited is maybe from the 90s and the early 2000s. We are in 2021 now. A lot has happened since then, and it's really important to make sure you keep current and acknowledge contemporary research if there is contemporary research related to your topic, which there often will be with will and employability in particular. And make sure you cite the right paper. Again, it's actually quite easy to do, but it's really important to not cite the wrong paper by the right author. And because our reviewers and editors in the Journal for Graduate Employability, we do read a lot of the literature related to that topic. So I often pick up where people have actually cited the wrong paper from the right author. And then it makes me really scrutinize your reference list and make sure that there aren't other errors, because it doesn't look good for the journal and it doesn't look good for you. So that's something that's important to focus on as well. And then my final advice is to learn to love peer review. I know that a lot of people hate it, and especially when the reviewer is not particularly tactful in giving their feedback, or they're actually just wrong and you disagree with what they say. Regardless of whether or not what they say is correct, even if they've misinterpreted your work, it is an opportunity to learn. And I would encourage you to think about how you can actually clarify what you've said, because if they've misinterpreted what you've said, it's quite likely that another reader will as well. So try and take it positively, appreciate that these people are dedicating their precious time to reviewing your work, and try and learn to love the peer review process. Bonnie, how am I going for time? Because I can talk a little bit about impact, but we can also go to discussion if we're already hit.
That's okay. Do you have something else just to wrap up?
Yeah, well, so one thing I thought I would touch on was another thing that I tend to think about in relation to my research is how I can expand my reach and impact. So because a lot of the time we do research related to our practice, we can implement a lot of the things that we learn through research at our own institution. But if you want to have broader impact beyond your institution, there are lots of ways that you can quite easily disseminate your research further. One of the simplest way is, when your research is published in a journal, to get your citations up and other people reading your research, think about, tweeting about it or using social and professional platforms. LinkedIn's another space that I use to update people about my research. Another thing that I do, because the topic of graduate employability also has a lot of sort of broad popular appeal, and so it's actually not hard to get your research in the news, sort of on radio or occasionally television, although being on television actually horrifies me, so it's not something I aim for personally, but I have certainly gotten my research referred to in newspaper articles and through radio interviews, and that can be a really good way of reaching a broader audience of the general public or people at sort of institutions beyond higher education. Essentially, I write a media release, and you can do that yourself, or you can work with the media team at your university. Generally, they provide some training on how to write a good media release, or they might even write the media release for you. So that's something that you can look into if you want to expand your reach. I also use platforms like ResearchGate and academia.edu.au. This is especially useful if you're publishing in somewhere which isn't open access. Then you can share your research with people who are interested, who don't have access to the journal through those platforms. So, they'll actually ask you to send them a copy, and you can share abstracts or eventually the whole paper. You can also, of course, highlight your research through presentations and conference papers. And while I like to write in journals with, I suppose, the metrics that are going to help me progress in my career, I also equally like to do sort of short conference papers. I find that they don't take as long to write. They're a really good way of sort of exploring your preliminary ideas about your research topic, getting feedback and sharing what you do with others. And you can also consider sort of writing blogs, whether that be a personal blog or on perhaps some sort of a blog at your own institution. And finally, don't forget to also disseminate your research at your own institution. So talk to your colleagues about it so that they know what you've been doing as well, and you might consider running workshops. We often share or are invited to share our research at other institutions, but then we don't talk to colleagues about it. So I think that, you're spending time on research and it's often most relevant to your own institution. So don't forget to actually share your research locally as well. And I think I'll stop there so that we have time for research. For discussion.
Thank you so much, Trina. I've been writing notes. I wasn't aware that your journal did 2,000 word rants, and it's something I'm quite excited about now. So thank you so much. All right, what we might do now is we're going to go into our, I'll get you to stop sharing. There we go. We're going to go now into our discussion room. So if you've got burning questions, make sure you bring them into those rooms. Or alternatively, this is a great space where you can meet each other. It's a great place to network as well. I'm going to open up those rooms now. We'll go in there for about, say, 15 minutes. And please enjoy your time. I'll see you back here in just a moment.